Hey everybody, Anthony and Bob Barker are back with another build. This time we're making a new dresser that goes along with the cabinet door that I just made on my last video. And this is going to be made mainly out of walnuts. We're planing down our wood here, and for some reason I put my shop vac on the opposite side, that way I can hit it every time I was running a board through. And it took me a few runs to realize that was probably a bad idea, so eventually I did switch it to the other side, and then we can continue getting our boards planed down. Now we're doing mainly solid walnut, and we're having to make a lot of panels for this build because I'm not using much plywood at all. So we want to make sure everything is a good uniform thickness for all of those glue ups. And this is a build that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. It's kind of nice because it's one of the few things that actually is meant to look nice and is just for me, and something that I will be using every day, not in my shop. But of course, since it's going in my bedroom, if I want it to stay there, it needs to be something that my wife will like as well. So definitely need to keep that in mind as I'm making it. And that's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to build it in the first place, because I do have a PlayStation that's been sitting next to my old beat down dresser that I've had for like 20 years. And it's just sitting kind of on a box on the ground next to it for longer than I'd like to admit. And the wife has never complained about it. So I needed to do something to rectify that. So here I am, just continue to get all these woods ready for the panel, and there was a split in this one, so I used that shop vac just to kind of suck the glue into that crack, and then I just clamped it together, and that crack was gone. So for these ones, just to make things easier for the glue ups, I am using dominoes on all of them. And since I'm making so many panels, I'm not going to show them all because it gets a little bit repetitive. But pretty much I'm going to be going through the same process of getting all the wood down to the same thickness, matching the grain patterns that I like going with each other, using those dominoes just to kind of help me with the alignment there. And of course, I like to glue the dominoes in place first, and then I come back and put the glue all across the seams, and then I throw them into my clamps and let those panels dry up. And with that clamping, I do like to put some smaller clamps on each one of the seams just to kind of keep those nice and even with each other. And then, of course, as many clamps as it takes across the length of it to make sure that it's going to make those joints appear seamless. And most of this build, I'm trying to do it out of mainly walnut, but I want to have some contrasting wood in there as well. So on top of that, we're going to be using curly maple for portions of it. And I was going to go with a regular maple, but I wanted something with just a little bit more pop, so I found some curly maple. Unfortunately, in the end, not quite enough for everything I wanted, but we got enough to get some good pop for different sections of it. So here we are doing a panel. My original intent was for this panel to actually be the top, because I really liked the figure in it. However, as I went through it, I realized that it got a little twisted, so I had to change my plans on that part. So the other part we're going to be using this curly maple on is for the front face frame. So we're going to have that just kind of give us a little bit of an extra contrast there, along with the dark walnut. And for the face frame, we're not going to be doing a complete regular one. I'm actually just going to attach the frame itself to the side panels, so I'm not going to have it completely framed out. So that's created a few different challenges, and so what I'm doing here is I'm cutting some extra pieces that are going to be spacers in between parts of it, which will make a little bit more sense as you see me doing the layout of the face frame. So the bottom part will still be the walnut, and then the rest of it is going to be that curly maple. And so I'm going to have room for 8 different drawers in this, and then that center square is going to be where there's going to be an open cabinet for my PlayStation. And you can see there with the spacers in how it's going to kind of help me get it to all even up when I glue it up and make sure that things sit where they should. So I am using some dominoes to keep this all together because it'll make it much easier. You can just do pocket holes from behind if you like, but as I did it, I realized I got too overzealous with my dominoes and I made one where it shouldn't be. Luckily, I actually did make an extra strip, so I was able just to replace it and just and get rid of that piece that I messed up, which is always good to have some extra ones cut to the same length if you can help it. Just that in case things like this happen where you get messed up, you have a backup so you don't have to try to get another piece and match it. So here we're finishing up our side panels for the dresser, and then I am going to be doing one plywood strip on the back end of it. So those are just some little dados that'll slide into, and now we can get on to gluing up our face frame. And this glue up here actually was an interesting one. A lot of times I feel kind of rushed and anxious about it just because you're on a time clock. But this one actually wasn't so bad. The reason being is because it's more just small pieces that can be kind of clamped individually, so you got a lot more breaks and less joints that you feel that time pressure on. And I do use a lot of that blue tape in those corners because you don't want all the squeeze out just to get all over the pieces that you're going to have to sand off later, because that would just be such a hassle. So you'll see like most of my glue ups here, I got a lot of painter's tape around. So I just keep on doing this a piece at a time, and I have multiple spacers that I made for each level. That way we can clamp it all together and things will stay where they're supposed to. And I also just got a couple extra strips of plywood and put them on the sides of the face frame. Those pieces you see like on the sides aren't actually part of the face frame itself. They're there just to make sure everything stays nice and straight during this glue up. And another thing I did do before this glue up is I sanded each one of these individual pieces, and I do try to avoid the spots where they're actually going to glue up because I don't want to create any dips in there to make it uneven. So after I took out the clamps, I put it next to the side panels, and here we're just laying out where our dominoes are going to go to connect the face frame to the side pieces. And of course we're going to have a couple supports on the top as well, so we need to mark those out, and there'll be support on the bottom. So to get this the dominoes in place, I found it was just easier to just clamp the pieces to the side of my workbench, and then I can just do the dominoes that way and kind of test out as I go to make sure that everything is aligning as I need it to. And to get all of them, you can see here there's a lot of dominoes all the way around. So next up, I wanted to do a quick test fit, and this actually was a little difficult because my floor has so many waves and dips in it. It was like there is no straight surface to do it on, so it made it a little bit more challenging, but it went together pretty nicely. So I was optimistic that the glue up would go well, although this is one that I took a couple days to think about while I was at work, and it was kind of just making me nervous on how it was going to go because it's a pretty big glue up. And my original plan was not to use any pocket holes on this part, so I definitely needed to get a better clamping solution because my existing clamps weren't big enough for it. So I just got some extra pipe clamps here that made this a much easier process. And you can kind of see me going back and forth. Getting the face frame in place was fine, but getting the supports to stay in place was a little bit more challenging. And it took a little bit longer than I would prefer, although it's still within the working time of the glue, so the joint should be fine. But since it took me a little bit longer, it made me nervous enough where I actually did go back afterwards and add a few pocket holes to those supports on the inner part of the very bottom part of the face frame and that little back support. But I put those like where you will never be able to see them. And there you can see all my new pipe clamps that really helped out so much on this particular glue up. I didn't quite get enough of them for all at once, so I just hooked a couple of my clamps together for the back parts to add a little pressure on those supports as well. So with the main dresser frame and cabinet done, we can get into the inner cabinet here. Now this is the wood that I mentioned earlier that was originally slated for the top, but it just got so twisted it just wasn't going to work. But I figured by breaking it down into smaller pieces, I can still work with a little bit of wobbliness in it and make it work for the inner cabinet. So that's what we're doing here. We broke it down into the other pieces, and then I'm going to be putting a small piece of walnut plywood in the back of this. So we put a little groove for that. And to attach it to the face frame, we will be using the dominoes as well. Like I said, another good option would be to do pocket hole screws, but this just kind of saves some time for me. So what I did is I did the bottom piece first because I'm going to have a little support underneath it for the back that's also going to double as my spot for to mount my drawer slides, the undermount slides. So here I am just kind of getting that piece ready. I use the front just to measure where it should be and to get it to the right height to that little support in the back. And then we'll kind of save that for later. So now we're going to be gluing up this inner cabinet part, and it's going to have just the bottom and two sides. I don't need a top on this one. It actually was a little bit short of what I needed it. So I used those spacers just to put it up a little bit and just screwed it into place. And then you'll never see that that's not quite level from the outside. So once we had that main part done, we can cut out on our plywood there. I just use 1/4 inch walnut plywood, the back piece, and then after we get that one out, we can test fit it to make sure it fits in as we expect it to, and it's slid in pretty nicely. So next up, we want to go ahead and get the rest of the cabinet ready for the sides to get more dominoes and keep this thing fully in place. So I just use a little extra piece there to make my domino sit nice and flat, and then just put a couple in on the vertical sides there. And then we got to think about the cords for the PlayStation. So I'm going to put just a small hole in the back panel, and that's going to end up going all the way through to the back. I thought about having it go from underneath, but and it just kind of creates a little bit more challenges with the cords. So I figured just going straight out the back with like a grommet would work just fine. So we'll throw a little finish on this because I wanted to make sure we did that first. It would just be easier than the finishing it once it actually gets in place. And then we can put a little bit of the same. We're just using Rubio Pure on everything for this one. We're going to be doing it on this as well. And then it looked really nice once you can kind of see all that figure pop on that curly maple. So for the back part, inside the groove for the back panel, I'm just screwing straight down into that support that's going to be going to the lower support, and this is also the one that will later be holding the brackets for my undermount slides. So you can kind of see it there, and it also helps hold this thing up while I'm clamping in place. And I use the dominoes and glues to get all this in place, and I didn't do the finish all the way to the very front because I wanted to make sure that I didn't like mess up with this glue up at all. And I just kind of did a little light sanding just to finish that up later, and then the finish did come out even. And then after that, I did anchor that cabinet just to the front end. I didn't want to do the back just to allow for a little bit of wood movement, just in case it moved a little bit differently than the walnut itself. And then we got a couple more scrap pieces of plywood so we can get some more supports that'll hold the undermount slides. Now the outer parts of those slides will just be going straight onto those side panels. But for these inner panels right here, you can see we're just going to offset it on each direction just a little bit down and about like 3/8 to the side, and that will be right where it needs to sit just to make these go on nice. And so once we do that, we're just going to screw these straight into the upper support and from below on the bottom support, and we'll do that on each side, and then those will sit nice to hold the inner portions of the slides. And then the supervisor showed up, and he was watching my work very carefully to make sure it was up to his mama's standards. So I was definitely on my best behavior. So next up, I was doing some of the roundovers, and I ended up doing roundovers on the majority of it, but I just did a really small 16-inch. Had to clean some up by hand, and there you can see an extra support. I ended up doing that on both sides because there was just a slight bow in those outer panels, and that helped kind of bring everything totally straight. That way I don't have any issues when I put my slides in later. So now we're going to be making the back panel. This is the other piece that's out of that same walnut plywood. And so we're just going to get this to its same size, and I put it in, measured out where that grommet hole is going to need to be, and then just drilled it out going from each side to make sure I don't get any tear out. And then we can put that to the side, and next up is getting the drawer slides on the side panels. And what I did to do this, I put a little stop of plywood on the bottom, and then I made different spacers that will show me exactly where the back end of this is supposed to sit, and the front end just sits on the face frame. I usually put about 1/8 of an inch set back, and you'll see I did do the bottom one first accidentally and realized I had to go the other way. And then I also want to mention for the back part, I put that in the slotted area and not in just the round holes. That way if there's wood movement, it has a little freedom to move on there too. And then to put the ones that are on the supports, it's much easier. Just slide it in place and just put a single screw there, and then those are ready to go. And another thing that was actually been really helpful is these little dollies that I just got from Harbor Freight. They help so much on heavy projects like this just to kind of move things around. So here we're temporarily putting in our back panel to make sure everything looks right, and it did. But I didn't put that all the way in place because I didn't want to get it into that little dado slot on the bottom, because it'll be too hard to pull out because I still got to put the finish on it later. So now we got to get to making a ton of drawers. I'm kind of going to move a little bit quicker through this part because at this point, I've made a lot of drawers on my channel and like the different videos, and I've kind of explained my process a lot. But the only thing I did do differently on this one, just because I had so many and it can be a little frustrating getting into the corners for the finish, I decided to for the back piece just to cut off that little part that holds it in. That way I can put in the bottom panel after I do the finish. And to be honest, I'm not really sure which way I like better. I think both ways have plus and minuses. And of course, I did use Baltic birch for this, and we're putting on just some iron-on edge banding just to make those edges look a little bit nicer. And to trim it, I've pretty much stopped using the actual specific tools for it because they just always seem to cause like tear out, and then I have to take the whole piece off and put a new one. So I found just like a razor works just fine. So now onto the glue up. I ended up just going with my go-to pocket holes. I considered doing like through dowels with like some walnut just for a little extra pop, but then I realized I have 8 drawers and like I really didn't want to do that for all of them on something that's really not going to be seen by pretty much anybody. So I just went with the pocket holes. And then I'm doing just wipe on polyurethane on all of them. And then here's the part where you kind of slide the panel in, and then just put a little screw or two on the back end just to lock it in place. And of course, you have to do the holes for the undermount slides, so I just use this little jig there to get everything lined up and speed up the process. Now, the more of these projects where I make a lot of drawers, I'm really kind of starting to head a little bit more toward thinking a little bit more like Keith Johnson. He usually has all of his drawers, the majority of his drawers, he gets them sent out and made just more for a time savings for him. And I'm starting to consider if that actually might be a good option for me in the future. But for now, I'll keep on making mine. But making this many on like a lot of projects, it is pretty time consuming. So here we are just kind of getting the nice test fit, and only one of them was a little off, so I had to adjust like a little spacer on one of the slides, but after that everything went really nicely. And then we can go on to making the drawer faces. And we will be using a solid walnut, and I actually got the riffs on walnut for these faces, which means we get to do a whole bunch of more panel glue ups as well. So here we are just getting those ready, and a big part of this is just looking at the grain patterns and looking for a pattern that is just pleasing to the eye for me. Then once we get that set up and those all glued up, we can get ready for how we're going to be opening these. So I didn't want any visible hardware on there. So for the finger pulls, I'm actually routing in this profile along the top. I kind of went back and forth if I wanted to do some on the bottom or the sides, but in the end, I felt like the top was just the way to go for this particular project. So it just went really, really slowly to avoid a chip out, and then kind of just routed in that nice groove. And I left the drawer faces together until I had all of that done, because I wanted to make sure that I can keep this as continuous grain looking as possible. So once I had that prepared, then I just took them over to my miter saw and cutting these down to side. And this is the back side facing up, and you can kind of make out, I lettered each one of these where they should be. That way I don't get it mixed up later. And don't ask me why I lettered instead of numbered. I kind of randomly just go back and forth in between the two, but for all the drawer faces, letters just seem like the right way to go. So after I get these cut to width, I'm cutting them to the right height and just running it all through my track saw to make sure it's as uniform as possible. And of course we did do this 8 times for all 8 drawers. Then the next thing I wanted to consider was the transition from the body to the top. And the top is going to have a solid piece of wood, so I felt like the transition would just look a little bit nicer if I just routed in a little shadow line. So I just got a rabbiting bit with my router and put that in, and I think that'll kind of make a little bit of a neater looking transition. And then after that, I just continued with the router, with my trim router here, and just doing a small round over on all of the surfaces on the rest of this from inside to out. And then, of course, I had to finish up the little inner corners just with some hand sanding. Next up was doing more of the finish with the Rubio Pure. And at this point, I was really happy and optimistic because the build had been going really well, and that may or may not be some foreshadowing for something to come, but it was looking really good at this point. I was happy with how all of the finish was coming out on that curly maple there, as well as the walnut. Everything just had like all the right pop, at least in my opinion. So after we had that done, we can go ahead and reinstall all our drawer slides. And I left the back panel off to do this just because it's a little bit easier to get to with it out. So after we have those all in place, we can go ahead and put in our back panel permanently. So we did have a small little groove in that bottom support that it sits in. So now we just use this little extra piece of wood and our mallet to smash it into place, and it was in there really firmly. So now here is the next glue up for the top part. And for this one, I had to go to 5 different lumber yards to get the wood for it, because they just didn't have enough of it anywhere. So I got what I could, and then we put it together and continued to finish it up and get it ready. And at this point, I thought it was doing okay. I was really curious to see how it was going to look once we get it on, though. So to prepare for that, we're putting these figure of 8 fasteners on the side, and I clamped an extra piece of scrap wood just so I don't get any tear out with the Forstner bit here. So we're going to do that there, and then we're going to do some screws in front that are just going to lock it into place, and then we're going to do some additional screw holes for the back, but I'm going to do a much bigger drill bit there. That way there's room for wood movement. And then I also use the Forstner bit on all of the drawers on the inner part so I can inset the screws and they won't catch on anything. And here is where things took a turn. As I'm finishing up the top, I realize I absolutely hate it. There's just too much variation in the color of the boards. There's a few blemishes, and there's just not as much figure as there was in the other curly maple that I had. So instead of trying to make it work, what I ended up doing is just scrapping this all together and getting some more walnut boards and making the top out of that. I was really bummed because it got rid of my idea of the contrasting colors there, but in the end, it actually worked out pretty well. So I do also want to mention for the finishes, I did 2 coats of Rubio on all of the walnut pieces. You do the first one, then come with that maroon pad to scuff it up, and do the second one, and it really does make a big difference on the finish of these pieces. And then the last part is this cabinet door, which I did a separate video, so check the link above for that. And then it's on to the final assembly, and I wanted to do the final assembly in my room just in case there's any little variations in how level my floors are, make sure it didn't shift once I got it in there. So I clamped that in place and just started doing those front screws, and then we ended up doing the back screws as well. And then for the ones for the figure of 8, I just did those by hand because those screws are a little bit smaller. And to keep everything nice and straight, I clamped a scrap piece of plywood all the way across. That way I'll make sure that those completely line up, which will be important once we get to the lower drawers there. So we just got them exactly where we needed to with our spacing, and then we put in screws. I did like 4 screws in each one of these just to make sure they will never move. Now as I'm doing this, I just kind of move my way down, just doing the same technique there. I was a little bit disappointed initially because the gaps that I chose doesn't really expose much of that curly maple face frame. Now, I was a little disappointed at first, but now I actually kind of like it. It's like one of those hidden features that you kind of discover as you're using it. So I think it just kind of feels like it gives it more depth now. Another thing that doesn't really come across as well on the video is the different colorations. Now I did the continuous grain across, and I also kind of did a little bit of the flow with the dark and light, but unfortunately it doesn't come across as noticeable in the video as it does when you see the piece in person. So here we are getting the final one in the home stretch, and the supervisor came to check, and he was definitely happy with the work. You can see with the wag of the tail and his paw of approval there. I do plan on making detailed plans on how to make this project if you're at all interested, and I'll probably do a list for hardwood as well as like a plywood build just for different budgets. And on top of that, now that the wife has seen the project and she likes it, I think I have now been committed to making a larger dresser for her, as well as some nightstands and a bed frame, so keep an eye out for those in the future as well. And that's going to cap off this build. It was a great, fun build, and I hope you guys like it. Give us a like, thumbs up, tell us what you think below. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in the next one.